On July 9th, 2026, to quote Pitchfork's review of Ken Carson's newest album, Experiment, the opening paragraph from Eli Ennis contained the following lines with respect to his Opium label mate and his mentor Playboi Carti's album, Music, from 2025. The gloriously messy, rage rap capstone could have brought a graceful conclusion to the era-defining metallurgic trap that Carti popularized with 2020's Whole Lotta Red. It was a near full circle finale that simultaneously celebrated and snuffed out its generational sound. The neat critical reception is that Music's untouchable extremity knocked Rage unconscious, both with its glass-shattering production and zeitgeist-engulfing sprawl. The messier truth is that Rage's fanbase is still growing, even as the sound is trending towards a sharp creative decline. Okay, make no mistake, when a publication allows a statement like this to be printed about a whole-ass musical genre or subgenre, it's not because it's actually over for the population at large, it's because they want it to be. They want to talk about something, anything else, their personal niche favorites in an increasingly siloed underground. The following line makes that very plain. Second wave ragers like Shay and Osama-san have cranked the genre's decibels as loud as they can tolerably go, and formerly refreshing stars like Yeat and Ken Carson are beginning to feel like the stewards of a stagnant sound. Again, that's a bold statement, full stop. One that I would truthfully struggle to write about any scene one way or the other. When I did a full-length video essay on the rise and seeming fall of bro country in the 2010s, even while many would argue the scene was long over in 2023, that was a capstone I refused to lay. Mostly because I heard way too many signifiers all across mainstream country to argue that the sound was gone so much as it was in its second wave and commercially omnipresent. And while you could argue that Rage has already gone through its rise at the end of the 2010s, the commercial crossover peak around 2022, 2023, when it got co-opted by bigger names, and then kind of ended with Playboi Carti's long-awaited third album last year, well longer than many more respected genres or subgenres have seen in music history, it's only a credible statement if you believe that Rage's creative relevance begins and ends with Playboi Carti and the biggest backed major label names who are around him. You would think that some culture writers would be a little smarter than that. And yet, this is where I come into this story, because I did not like Rage music for damn near its entire lifespan. I don't like any Playboi Carti album, not even the ones that some would call classics today. I think he's been wildly overrated by those who prioritize attitude and aura over good artistry and technique. And I mean, Yeats never really impressed me much. The majority of the Rage I heard crossover seemed barely worth the coverage on Billboard Breakdown, let alone full-length album reviews, especially when I wasn't gonna like them. And as such, I played Live and Let Live. I didn't engage unless I had to. It just wasn't for me. I accepted that. And as such, I didn't really attract the attention of fan bases who seemed to have a little bit too much time on their hands to make my life miserable. But the fastest way to become irrelevant to the bigger conversation is to ignore it, neglect some of the nuance. And at some point I realized I had to confront a beast that just wasn't going anywhere. With more artists, a growing young fan base that gets and adores the sound, and a second creative wave seemingly materializing. And thus, in the summer of 2026, this became my task. I'm going to explore 10 names who dropped Rage or Rage-adjacent projects this year in 2026 from a list curated by a friend of mine in underground hip-hop. I'm not promising that this either will win me over or I come out the other side with newfound Playboi Carti appreciation, but this is going to be my fairest shot at trying to appreciate and get this genre. And I don't know, you miss all the shots you don't take. And if you think that's corny wordplay, you haven't heard a lot of what passes on these albums. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and where I attempt my summer of rage. I attempt to get into 2026 rage music. Wish me luck. I think I'm gonna need it. I think we have to start this conversation with well, what rage is as a musical genre, which might wind up contentious when we get into the slate of artists I'm going to try to explore, but it's good to set the baseline. If we're working off of Wikipedia's broad definition, early rage music is a subgenre of a subgenre, characterized by cycling synth leads that draw from future bass, hyperpop, or chiptune, crushing bass-heavy 808 drums, aggressive trap rhythms, and a lot of distorted auto-tune vocals, with the name rage being colloquially interchangeable with moshing, opening up the pit, especially in a live setting like a concert or a festival. And from there, really, there are a lot of potential avenues to cross over with that sound. And while certain producer cliques have specific signifiers, and there might be specific expectations of content or delivery or tone, we'll come back to that, there's actually a surprising amount of wiggle room with where the genre can go next. From more guitar-driven rap rock to brighter hyperpop or digicore, from crushing industrial electronics to sweeter melodies that align with plug, trap R&B, or even pop rap. For rage to have been called a dead end musical genre or sound, there are a surprising number of lanes where one could experiment even within the formula. In that, it reminds me a lot of where trap evolved in the mid-2010s, from a lot of its roots in grimy southern hip-hop to basically spreading into nearly every other genre, from pop to country to even rock and metal. But there seems to be an interesting point of tension within rage as a subgenre. There's a breadth of possibilities in which to experiment and expand, but also a somewhat narrow window in how much expansion seems to be tolerated. Genre signifiers that folks seem to expect and sounding rather wary of when there's a swerve, until that swerve catches fire and then is mercilessly copied. When my friend curating this list saw that initial Pitchfork statement, that was their general reaction. Not that it was so much wrong, but kind of incomplete. And that's to say nothing of the major labels and the mainstream, which certainly want a big piece of this sound and its money and its audience, but seems to be still trying to feel out how to get in, especially for a pop crossover. It's relevant to highlight that many of the major names have been backed by the industry relatively early, including some of the earliest names cited as originators, like Kid Cudi and the whole Mr. Rager thing, or OG Mako. And while it's relevant to highlight how many germinated on SoundCloud throughout the 2010s, by 2017 and Playboi Carti's self-titled mixtape, he was already on Interscope. Lil Uzi Vert, who has ties to rage, has been on Atlantic. Trippie Redd's been with 10,000 Projects, a label run by Elliot Grange, the son of the infamous record executive Lucian Grange. I bring all this up because while I'm going to mention some artists who are both backed and independent, at its core, and from damn near its origin and inception, rage has had the aesthetic of being very angry and abrasive and challenging, not part of your system, man, but not exactly revolutionary or built to upend the status quo. This might be why to some who only know the subgenre through its loudest artists with the longest string of allegations, it might come across as kinda lacking a stronger underlying ethos. Far more sound and style than substance, a scene to hop on and get hype rather than something that the culture might be feeling more deeply at large. So okay, take someone like myself, who up until this point really only engaged with the sound via the Billboard charting entries or the occasional festival performance I stumbled into, and who didn't really like a lot of what he heard for a variety of reasons, but I'm trying to give all this the benefit of the doubt. And what do you know? There's a big name who just so happened to drop a project a couple weeks ago.
Glock 10 mil, get them sick, ARP, hit them, swap hoes out, I did them, swap clothes out, I did them, grab Simmons, rig, oh, double low, 5, YBL, bigger than the big show.
Alright, the biggest name on Opium that doesn't appear at time of recording to have horrific allegations against him. And even then, a lot of the mixed outright negative buzz from critics I respected kept me well away from him. Cause look, I went back to listen to Ken Carson's great chaos and more chaos before this, I wanted to understand and give him a fair chance beyond the crushed out mixes and the utter lack of interesting content beyond stock brand names, graphic sex, flashes of violence, and some bafflingly tension-destroying pop culture references. And sure, there's a modest improvement of energy and flows in between the two albums, a couple moments that had some brash bombast and even competent mastering, but was it really enough of an improvement to support a full, bloated project where modulation and dynamics and subtlety are alien concepts to seemingly everyone involved? Well, given my expectations were effectively rock bottom, it was good for Ken Carson to then live down to them. For as much as he claimed on Shade Sun, where he just rips the instrumental from Two Hollis's Girl and all of its jittery gothic trap minimalism, and is considerably worse on it, that no matter what he makes, they would call it rage. I don't know, based off the sound and definition he helped craft, the vast majority of this album is just that, with various levels of speaker-breaking distortion. Hell, when he hops on some relatively stock trap beats like Drug Kit with a sleepwalking young thug, I probably would have been more engaged if he actually tried to be more experimental, and if he had the artistic instincts to tell his producers to not get in the way. Seriously, if someone can define what the actual tune is supposed to be behind Death Note with Playboy Cardi still doing his really bad Future impression, or the ugly gurgle of FW00, or the flagrant brand name porn of Shopping with Destroy Lonely, who somehow sounds even lazier and only slightly better on The Ritual, yeah, you know what, don't bother tell me. This all still sounds like ass. And from there, it's about an hour of colicky slapdash flows, chalky grinding beats that smother any interesting melody, and Ken Carson utterly unable to keep a consistent tone because he'll wallow in brand name debauchery with wildly inconsistent personality and then kill all the atmosphere with a hashtag rap line that throws me clean out of any abbreviated song. When Lil Uzi Vert shows up on Ghost, it helped me appreciate an artist who can actually galvanize a stage with their vapid but manic energy, something Ken Carson can barely do, as he makes a truly out-of-nowhere Star Wars Clone Wars reference on that hook that makes less sense the more you actually try to think about it. And yet, if you can bend your mind to his brand of empty and relentlessly juvenile flexing, and with the acknowledgement that all of this would probably translate better live, where some of the production missteps aren't so glaring within the bass clipping and all the compression that it's crushing out what could be big, interesting ideas. I blame Filthy for a lot of this, especially on Addiction here. There is a certain kinetic victory lap rapture in some moments. The flow of Wrist into the brighter EDM is pretty fun. The keening confusion in the breakup of Flamethrower works decently, and it goes into the sharper knock of, well, Knocking, where the swampy bass distortion is actually competently mastered. And I actually like the extended fluttery shrug that is, well, interlude. But if you're left thinking that all this feels like the tackiest sort of power fantasy, more reminiscent of the trap rappers who rely a lot more on production or vibes for their luxury porn than actually saying anything, yeah, I don't know, it's the same general impression I've had with Rage from the very jump. Probably not a good starting point. And if you're walking away thinking that this is Rage's stagnant endgame, I might actually understand you. But you know what? Let's try to go deeper, because this can't be it, right? Bad first impression, sure, but I knew that going in with any act off of Opium from Playboy Cardi on down, or really whatever the mainstream is gonna push from the top down. If you let a scene only be defined by its biggest names, you are playing the major label game and letting them dictate the terms, and I'm not about to do that. So okay, let's talk about an act that actually did get signed to a major and then left to put out more on his own, who hasn't even turned 20 yet and is already on his third album.
I'm going to say, 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 I'm going to say.
So for those those of you who might be scratching your heads at this name, he used to be called Baby Santana and had a bit of a blow up in the early 2020s. He's also out of Georgia like Ken Carson. He had a big single that went viral, got a remix with Lil Tecca. He got signed by Republic, and at least off those first two albums, it's pretty easy to hear why. Tana has sharper pop instincts, and as a producer, there was some very obvious Young Thug melodic influences that could be balanced off well alongside some glances at Chief Keef. He chose some rubbery and chirpy plug R&B textures, and if you wanted rage-adjacent sounds that could be a little bit more marketable to the ladies, maybe even with a little bit more vulnerability with some of the R&B influences, a lot of that makes sense. Yeah, the flows were really sloppy, and there was a general lack of refinement on those Republic albums, but come on, he was a teenager. I'm gonna blame Republic for signing this kid still in high school and utterly failing to execute on any sort of artistic development. That's their job. But now he's on his own. Hopefully he learned something from his time over on Republic. And, okay, you know what? If this is your introduction to Tana now, you might be a little bit surprised why I'm including this on this list at all. Because in comparison with someone more emblematic of the scene like Ken Carson, there seems to be a lot less of the stereotypical rage signifiers, especially when it comes to the blaring synths and the distortion. Tana is a little softer. There's definitely more in the way of the spacious cloud rap and plug R&B, or just outright trap grooves with a very prominent Young Thug influence. This is an album where the song construction and production refinement drop on Republic and actually get some decent mainstream reviews, and was quite frankly a lot better than I expected. Now, there was absolutely more rage on his first couple of albums, so if you're just looking for just that, you might be a bit disappointed outside of Insane for Your Love or I Like Her, but Me shows a variety and sprawl that very quickly shows that not only did Tana develop some sharper flows and refined melodic chops in the meantime, acutely aware of being ahead of the curve for his age across the board, and that his newfound lifestyle can feel kind of ridiculous while still being in school and can't even drink yet, but there's a diversity to his subgenre exploration and competence to his execution that's seemingly beyond his years. Now this produces an interesting quandary we're probably gonna have to explore further, and that again is genre definition. Who is allowed to be within a space, get certain features, get certain producers, and who is not. And given that playlists are often built off a certain uniformity, that matters. And where despite Tana delivering a more polished and diverse album, it's not really received the same attention in comparison with a lot of the rest of the rage scene. Hell, while I'm criticizing it, the content's also pretty by-the-numbers flexing and fucking. That certainly fits in along that line, where I really hoped more would be sitting behind a pretty shallow curtain, and didn't really happen. And yet with all that, it is kind of a shame I think this is getting overlooked, because starting around Pray for My Mama, he hits a pretty solid run of songs, like the glossy drive of Everything Will Be Fine, the lines about how all his hoes are bisexual and none are straight. That could almost be a little fascinating if it was anything beyond wish fulfillment, but it is kind of amusing how queerness feels more broadly accepted overall. We are going to have to come back to that, to the genuinely great throwback buzzy pulse of Not Safe for Work the Prelude, and a really strong hammering rock pulse driving again. In fact, the entire back half of this album, it has some shockingly forward-thinking production around rap and R&B, where even if not every experiment works, the drumline touches on the strikingly ethereal Dear Jody certainly is a choice, and that's before it goes down to pure acoustic ballad territory. And again, I don't love the closing track. Tana's got a lot of potential, inside rage or outside of it. Hell, off the back half alone, Me by Tana is absolutely worth a recommendation. I want to hear more. But alright, fine. If you're of the opinion that I'm cheating here and it doesn't really count as rage music off the list I was given, and of course that's got to be the reason why I'm praising it, let's get something more demonstrably rage just a state over. A fresh debut for this year from another teenager with some tangible technical prowess.
When it's all said and done, they gon' know who the one, they gon' know who the one. When it's all said and done, they gon' know who the one, they gon' know who the one. When I pull
Okay, this is Vax, or VaxFR. These guys switch through names and streaming profiles like screen names, something you just gotta get used to if you want to get into them. And at least in terms of more demonstrable rage signifiers, yeah, he's got them. The chirpier synth melodies are prettier, dabbling across digicore and glassy hyperpop. There's more energy to the gauzy, auto-tuned squawks, and naturally the bass is flattened to the point of crushing the trap percussion into a lot of chalky fragments. If Vax has unique signifiers, they might be a sharper melodic flows, and how that glitchy blur of roiling synth stutters and undulates in some challengingly noisy ways, bends even a little more towards dance music. He's a more technically competent rapper with a lot of energy, and the transitions are remarkably well executed given the tinny slurries that he's working with, like the dance patter pitched up into Hit Me Up, or how Crushed breaks into glassy fragments before the main synth line ramps into the chiptune of Race, which then flows naturally into the shimmering cascades of Never Die, and then hits the grinding burst of Best Friend. I still have my issues with all this, trust me, we'll get to it, but you can tell he cares a little bit more compositionally, and his commitment to more vocal melody helps the hooks punch a little harder, like on M&M's or the manic double time of Race. Race is probably my favorite song here. And yet, at some point, you are going to recognize that Vax isn't saying all that much. And yeah, this is something that I absolutely expected going in. I knew that much like modern trap, Rage doesn't exactly have a reputation for good lyricism, or much lyricism at all. It's riding more on production that's built for the live show, don't think about it that hard, and not gonna lie, that kind of feels like a bit of a cop-out to me. There are lyrics here, just because you're choosing not to pay attention to them doesn't mean that I have to do the same. And you know, if the writing was actually good, you would praise it, so you don't get the benefit of the double standard. But at the same time, I'm also not going to claim that they have to matter as deeply. I grew up in the 2000s, the era of brash and loud southern hip-hop, the crunk years, where Lil Jon's ad-libs had the power to set off any party no matter what he's saying, where the flows were often more basic and the content was just as meat-headed and shallow. From music that is intended for the pit or just to get hyped, sometimes you gotta meet it where it is, where broad declarative statements for hooks are what works most effectively. I might go to my grave swearing that dense bars and anthemic bruising production can coexist and create perhaps a more elevated experience, but I'm also sure that outside maybe Run the Jewels, I'm the exception. Not really the rule here. But you know, even with all that established, I do think Vax's writing feels a little bit thin. You can be simplistic in your style, but still produce some evocative imagery, and sharper technical flows can only excuse so much for so long. What might be more interesting is how oddly tentative he is to approach the slightly edgier sentiments, like that Charlie Kirk meme shot on Familia, or the Guantanamo Bay reference on Best Friend. I'm gonna leave that with no context. It's funnier. Look it up. But if I am going to try to go deeper here, the more fascinating attitude is how, well, optimistic, or even love-struck and sincere it feels on cuts like Hit Me Up. It's got some of the expected youthful angst, but a song like Never Die underscores that teenage euphoria of never wanting to die, instead of wanting to get old and experience everything that life has had to offer with no regrets. Where even if he's got a lot of the same violent or hedonistic cliches of the genre, it feels like they're more perfunctory to check off a box to the wild, joyful energy he brings forward. And that can be jarring as hell on the girl comes back post-breakup and he gloats on Lilac, or when he references the cutting marks on the girl's wrist on the closing track, where he's telling her it's all okay. I'm not sure he really meets the mood or severity of the song, but it also gives him a slightly different lane in comparison with the nihilistic wallow you often hear, and it's prompted a certain backlash or a more of an ideological struggle at the very core of Rage. And you know, he happens to feature another Rage artist on one of the most propulsive songs with Race, and who really did stand out to me. One who has attracted considerably more attention and sits at the epicenter of all that discourse.
me what you owe, cause you won't live that down. I call her sloppy Joe, no way that she get down. Let off another round, I smoke another pound. Second round, I'ma knock him out this time.
If you've heard a name pop up around Rage discourse that's getting both commercial and some critical traction in 2026, it's Slayr. And yeah, I guess I'm going to be on the bandwagon for this one for damn good reason. He had easily one of the most interesting and creative catalogs I explored, with a wealth of talent as both rapper and producer, including a better XXL freestyle than any would expect. This guy can actually spit, where even if you can tell he sits a little in the shadow of Playboy Cardi and some of the squeakier ad-libs, his flashier melodies and more inventive, dare I even say genre-breaking production is easily some of the most colorful and melodic of this wave, or hell, that I've even heard this year. There were points where I was almost inclined to bypass the inconsistent mixing for the sheer wild, borderline symphonic flair, along with effortless transitions that should not work nearly as well as they do, like the shimmering sparkle of the keys and guitars at the end of Demigod, or the swell of auto-tune sing-along in the Skye with a goddamn guitar and synth solo. And then you get songs like Never Go Down, where the churning, filthy bass proves he can play that side of it too, where Power 4 samples goddamn Skillet, and it might be the best thing associated with that band in 15 years. And while I think previous projects of his might have a little bit more of the bombastic shifts that I like, listening through this year's deluxe reissue of Half-Blood, naturally called Bloodluxe, highlights a skill for infectious and pop and rock ready hooks that we really haven't heard since Juice WRLD, and he himself gets a shout out on Sloppy Joe, rest in peace. I want to circle back to the transitions because of the way that Half-Blood plays like two extended sets on the same project, the original and the deluxe, and the transitional crescendos are just spellbinding. Hard Knock riding the guitars into the grinding flash out freestyle, later echoed in how the guitars of Rax leap into the bounce of Paint a Picture, how the gauzy keys at 24/7 slow into the stomping arpeggios of Phone Interlude, the transitions across the chirpier flips inside Toxic and Love Blur. It's all designed to drive sheer momentum for the live show, where he can just run through the whole damn album, and it's the rare case where the melodies are so flashy and sticky, I could get behind it, regardless of any issues I might have with the content. And yeah, even with the acknowledgement that the lyrics aren't especially impressive on the surface, there is a little bit more if you want to dig for it. Slayr's actually got some comparisons to Kendrick Lamar of all people, and how he's been anointed by the industry in comparison with less respectable acts. We'll have a lot more to say on that in a little bit. But certain lines on Eyesight about wanting natural shit definitely kind of reminded me of Humble, similar to his exasperation with certain drug abuse on Death by MP3. But more specifically, there is a sincere vulnerability that he puts on record in how he talks about romance, a focus on competitive skill where Slayr has doubled down on his ascendancy over any veneer of cool. In other words, outside of nitpicks on my end, like that chirpy springiness on the closer of Set in Stone, which just feels kind of awkward to end a project with, if there's gonna be the next face of Rage, I don't know, Slayr is a very easy pick, and where I got absolutely no qualm saying Half-Blood Bloodluxe is legit great on the melodies and hooks alone. I genuinely did not expect that I'd find a Rage act I would praise with so little qualification. Slayr makes the list for me, and yet the fact that I'm saying all this might be at the roots of the animosity and backlash brewing against him as we speak. And unfortunately, there's no real way to talk about Slayr without at least mentioning that backlash, which has been often bound up in what's being called, I have to say this, burger music. For those of you who don't know, it's basically highlighting a brand of pop-ready accessibility in the art that could be played at a fast food joint. And Slayr's real last name being McDonald does not remotely help matters here. It's other words for like normie music. It's mainstream, it's coworker music, it's cringe, so of course millennials like me like it, especially if it's associated with nerdier hobbies or niches. The definition of uncool sincerity, even positivity, but also backed enough by the industry that it could get elevated over the material that's actually innovating and challenging and raw. You might as well say that he's selling out. Of course, there's a very certain irony that up until recently, Slayr hasn't been backed or sold much of anything commercially, certainly not compared to the actual originators of the scene who were backed on major labels with huge features. But truthfully, some of the influencers peddling the burger music lingo don't exactly appear to give a shit about coherent facts. It's not about what's actually bubbling up under the underground or counterculture, it's just vibes. That's why they call it burger instead of when Travis Scott sold a goddamn McDonald's meal. But truthfully, if I want to give them a little credit, play devil's advocate, I think there is something to it, especially when you factor in on the emotional surface level. Rage has some traits of youthful counterculture and was certainly targeted most at that demographic. The critics didn't get it, certainly not at the time. The broad sweep of angry alienation without much in the way of challenging stakes. It put me in mind of a lot of the acts that appealed to angry white boys in the late 90s and 2000s that were looking to shock and offend, wallow in the venal and the bass because it would piss off the gatekeepers or the critics or most likely their parents. And like some of those scenes in decades past, there is something a little reactionary lurking underneath all the shock and bad taste. In the 90s, it was considered the backlash to political correctness and bubblegum pop. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, a backlash to woke progressivism or millennial pop across genres, I guess. Less for any direct political project and more for targeting the presumed status quo, wanting to be on the outside. A lot of anger, but not the cleanest direction for it. And in both cases, it's linked to a tangible, youthful malaise that I certainly understand, with even more justification for the kids today who are seeing any prospects of their lives only getting worse as they get older. In a case like this, Slayer's pop accessibility and optimism, he opens up the album with the glossy crooning of Brain Fog, which is a plea for love and his refusal to compromise in order to please online internet dudes, and all that which could spread rage to a wider audience. That's the reason he's become a target compared to those who brute force their rapacious unlistenability into popular consciousness and got popular as a result. It's the same reactionary populist sentiment of being the underdog despite the treasure trove of wealth and ears to get in front of audiences, with considerably more slapdash effort that's on display. But again, part of that's also the point. By showing some level of compositional refinement and markedly better mixing, Slayr is showing effort, and to those who are trying to maintain a veneer of cool distance, that could be considered borderline offensive, exclusionary, especially if the sound or themes aren't so openly nihilistic, and especially if on some technical level he's just better than a lot of them. Of course, the whole burger music thing is just in-house jargon, and if you're on the outside with all the more perspective, it begins to feel a little juvenile, incoherent. And while on some level that is also part of the point, constructing their own public away from you, where it's more about the power to enforce contradictions and illogic, where is all that gonna build? All the nascent contradictions aside, and how this sort of closed circle nihilism tends to leave artistic movements swallowing their own tail and getting really tedious really fast. Oh, I get that statement around Ken Carson, I guess. If you really want to get dark and edgy with it, and you're actually into experimental music that is on the cutting edge, you've already heard heavier and more challenging art than what a lot of mainstream rage puts forward, where abrasive sound and subject matter comes together for some real tangible nightmare fuel. And I could start listing names where rage probably has drawn a lot of influence, start with Death Grips and go from there, but that would also kind of be missing the point, making it a little too real for some folks. For example, y'all know the guy who wants to fit in with the new hobby of all the cool kids and thus gets a little too into it and goes further and deeper into the hobby, and where he goes to show off a lot of his newfound knowledge, the cool kids are even more alienated. Pay no attention to what I'm doing with this video, because it's partially because he's trying too hard, but also because he's exposed the social secret that most cool groups aren't nearly as edgy or challenging as their posturing. And deep down, they kind of know that. Because let's be real, how challenging is rage? Really? Again, it's a genre largely birthed in the mainstream by major label names who are market tested for accessibility. There are hooks, familiar drums here, to say nothing of subject matter that if you put on the average rap song the past 20 or so years, they are really not that far afield. Like, if I really wanted to challenge someone, I could put on Shay or Osama-san from last year, or you know what, how about another deluxe reissue from this year? So there's another side to the Rage conversation that gets more dank, for lack of better words, where it's far less about a coherent song or attitude and more about the arms race of distortion, demented sound, where you're not sure what level of irony it pretends to be on as waves of contorted glitch and compression just concuss you, where there's absolutely no concern with mainstream accessibility when you can get a meme to ring off and trigger brain rot across the internet, really leave your mark. And that's the space where you can find Too Slimey, and this deluxe reissue of his full-length debut High Anxiety from last year. This is naturally called More Anxiety. And it should go without saying that if you were looking to test my patience without having digested any Rage music, or really test the patience of the vast majority of hip-hop fans, or fans of music, Too Slimey is at that epicenter, where what is even song structure or coherent vocals or tune where you can bludgeon the listener over the head with such distortion, which has prompted more comparisons to industrial noise and avant-garde abstract art than hip-hop or Rage. If Slayr is burger music, Too Slimey is presenting a puck of semi-solid animal feces where it screams in your face rather than answer on what level of irony it's operating, or whether or not he's trolling, or just taking the piss. And truthfully, there's value in all of that. On my most base level, I remember my teenage years when we would search for the most insane stuff you could find on the 2000s internet, the early progenitors to memes, where humor or weirdness or outright fucking nonsense traveled way further than, I don't know, quality. It's silly, again, probably a little juvenile, but that's the spirit in which it's made. That's why it works. Why not meet it where it is? I showed Too Slimey to my wife and she just started laughing at the sheer absurdity. Why can't there be a space for that? And from the other side, if I were looking to assess More Anxiety as more abstract art, drawing parallels to experimental industrial or power electronics or noise music, actually approach it earnestly in defiance of, well, everything, you could call that based. It would work too. And I'm going to be embarrassingly honest, on some level there are cuts here that I somewhat like, when I can find a foundation in the groove or increasingly jagged melodies, the occasional crescendo before it gets smothered. Bring 'Em Out coulda kicked a lot of ass with a better MC on the song, I swear. The pulsing noise grind of Throw Up, the guttural crunch of Punk Punk, the braying waves of Rolling Off Molly that transition to the squealing euphoria of Pop-A-Lot, and especially the hilariously crushing raves of, why not call it rock? Now, all of this kind of makes sense and works. In theory, Too Slimey can be fun to talk around, but the actual experience of More Anxiety is gonna test that. Let's not get too brain broken here. It's telling that Too Slimey has been paired with a lot of Family Guy edits on social media, because both will drag a joke to the point where you gotta be stoned out of your gourd for it to really come around to be funny yet again. And More Anxiety being a longer experience is gonna test your patience. One thing working on a Rage video essay will prove is that ear fatigue is absolutely real, and listening to a lot of Too Slimey back-to-back has convinced me that if there is a dead end to this distortion compression arms race, it's here, where the question gets closer to, what the fuck are we even doing? This is kind of exhausting. And on the flip side, if you actually do want to treat it as more than just a joke or ironic punchline or meme, well, presuming you can get past the lack of melodic hooks or competent mastering or song structure beyond a single bubbling idea, or can make out anything Too Slimey has to say in the garbled auto-tune and off-rhythm flows. Sometimes on cuts like Live and Bass, he gets this sharper rasp, and while it sounds like throat torture, he could afford to use it and just be better for it. It's a lot of stock, vapid flexing and cliches. Remain the same goofy pop culture references that are ironically mirrored in what's branded as burger music. I mean, you'd think if he was truly doing something avant-garde and transgressive, there would be at least the implication of greater depth beyond the excess to the point of absurdity. It creates the impression that once the gimmick starts wearing thin and Too Slimy has to deliver actual songs, he might be in trouble. Although cuts like the actually tuneful Pop-A-Lot and Legion show where he could do it, especially with that Stormy Strings outro that comes out of nowhere on the latter song. But will that be what the ironic fans truly want to hear? I gotta wonder. Now look, all this is for me to say that I think there should be a space in a scene like this for acts like Too Slimy. Seriously or not. Once you can worm your way into a headspace, there's at least a consistent blown out migraine that can manifest. His album can live up to its title, and while you'd have to pay me a considerable amount of money to talk about this in any other setting, or if you actually want me to review his album in another form, it's not a bad thing to have passing for an upper bound on this sound, a sign at the dead end that prevents you from roaring off the cliff. I'll give him that.
Let the house burn. I don't let the cigarette you smoke. I mean the fact, yeah, I'm smoking out the pants. I need the pussy, watch out. I sing the tail, catch out.
I just realized it's dead-ass Virgo season.
What? Panties on, she walking from my crib.
So let's take a bit of a swerve and go to the other side of the Atlantic for this next one. From London, England, and a member of the rap group Forsona that also features acts like Shay and Rich Amiri, Skaiwater initially gave me the impression of being a little bit more creative in terms of the sheer melody and sample choices, which alongside a few other projects in the mid-2020s got them a deal with Capitol and the well-received triplet of Pink Print EPs. No Nicki Minaj connection that I can identify, thank God for that. And now on this album Wonderful, that translates to pulling from a lusher soundscape, like the string samples on As Above So Below, or the gospel touches on Skins, the breezy guitar foundation on Let the House Burn, or the wailing guitars behind Zoot, the Sister Sledge sample behind A Threesome, or the just awesome T-Steel supported drum breakdown on Midsummer that really should have been the album closer. Specifically, there are 5 songs named after films on this project that are stylized in lowercase, where connection to said films is kind of tenuous, which stand in sharp contrast to the all caps and more conventional rage cuts, and it translates to a little bit more lyrical ambition and sketching out those questionable relationships there, but more importantly dabbling in more ethereal plug-in R&B. The subgenre term for ethereal R&B blending with trap, and some Jersey club, to serve as the stark, half-toxic Bonnie and Clyde romance on the run cuts, where Skaiwater often presents themselves as the incubus/succubus that's alluring their partners into their web. And you know what, based off their pronouns, it should be very obvious that they are non-binary, which, like with Lil Uzi Vert, seems to go unremarked upon in their music. Skaiwater prefers to stick to more debauched subject matter really across the board, awash in a lot of expensive brand names, sex, and drugs. You all get the opinion, mostly because of their chirpy, squawking flows and yowling ad-libs feel like they're constantly on the cusp of falling off rhythm, and production that's at the point of imploding into a lot of overcompressed glop that's split in by producer punch-ins and the sound of a smash from Super Smash Brothers. And you know, it's about time we talk a little bit more about the specific distortion on Rage Records, because for me, training my ears to accept or even accommodate it was the biggest hurdle to any of this, and I will not say this exercise I got all the way there. It's easily the most iconic element of the scene, for better or worse, of a Rage song, that bass-boosted compressed grind that seems to smother out the mix, designed to rattle speakers and glassware and present the feeling of being caught up in that churning mosh pit where your ears are ringing hours later when you then collapse in exhaustion. Many have highlighted that this is an extrapolation of what blew up a lot on SoundCloud. Insert a lot of XXXTentacion digressions here, but bass-boosted records have existed for decades, from specifically mastered remixes to compress and amplify those bass frequencies to just tuning the EQ on your stereo in order to maximize that grit and distortion in the low end. And you know, characteristically, I haven't really liked a lot of this approach, especially when a lot of that SoundCloud rap crossed over in the mid-2010s. And having been exposed to way more of it in the course of making this video, yeah, again, I'm still not fully there, but I think there's some nuance to my opinion this time. This is not coming from someone who doesn't like bass-heavy music. Again, I grew up in the crunk era. I speak highly of the car test where your trunk can knock with that bass. When Big Crit makes a My Sub song, it becomes a test for my system in my house, so much as you can generate and shape that bass frequency. And a lot of it comes down to differences in mixing and mastering that bass, where with Rage, I tend to like specifically where it's amplifying the heavier 808s while not letting it aggressively smother all the melody in all the other channels. A choice of whether you compress an individual signal versus the whole mix, or more likely finding a balance in between. And even then, a lot of this comes down to just consistency and creating some sort of coherent atmosphere for me to get deluged in. I can actually tolerate Too Slimy more than Ken Carson because the former's engineering feels like a unified vision track over track. There is some care paid to the sequencing and the flow of all these blown out fragments. Whereas with Ken Carson and his motley crew of producers, it feels like this splatter painting with the mastering approach that's changing from track to track, and it gets actively exhausting with the flimsy justification of it being experimental, when truthfully, it's anything but. We've heard experimental stuff here. But again, I also know I'm nitpicking, and truthfully, the bass-boosted compression of a lot of Rage can be very hit and miss for me, because it feels like an attempt to recreate a lot of the live experience on an actual record, to sound cacophonous and distorted and huge when, I don't know, my general argument against it is that you can have a traditionally mastered record that can still induce this effect actually live. You don't have to do it on the main recording, which at least for me translates a little better. But then I remembered how much Rage music's targeted at teenagers, or maybe folks who probably don't have the money to go see or travel to see some of their favorites live, but still want something that would be close to mimicking that experience. Maybe it's a leap to say it, but there is a certain populism in crafting the live experience on record for those who couldn't get it in person, especially in the era of skyrocketing ticket cost and a scene where the live pit might be prioritized, where if you close your eyes and it's just loud enough, you might be able to imagine yourself there. I mean, it's not like this is out of pocket either. It's the rationale behind why live albums sell in any genre, or why bootlegs of jam bands move the way they do. Rage just takes the next step and makes it explicit and populist, and to the target audience, I get why it could work. Now, to get back to Skaiwater, well, I see every side with it. The wildly inconsistent mastering choices between Shay-esque smothering distortion and some of the softer cuts, they might feel more considered. There's an artistic rationale behind it, but the combination of whiplash, questionable sequencing, where they don't even fully commit to the movie title gimmick where they want to have a softer hook, or how Blink Twice incorporates this fluttery Hatsune Miku passage alongside the bed springs and some very questionably mixed Jersey Club percussion, and the runtime that just feels way too bloated. It's too clunkily executed to win me over. Skaiwater gives me the impression of having a lot more ideas and energy than the ability to convincingly execute upon them, which leaves me a lot more frustrated with Wonderful than outright liking it, especially as someone would argue that Capitol has not brought enough artistic development to bear and to focus Skaiwater's ambitions. But again, when sounding raw and messy is built into the artist's baseline appeal for their audiences, and Skaiwater is now shouting about fuck a major label on Maryland and some half-formed musings about better indie times before on the hazy closer My Zombie, which implies that their independence might be in the cards, why would Capitol even bother? I don't know, maybe we have to go deeper again. Try another non-binary act, but a little bit more underground this time.
Made my move with a play come through and a pass touchdown. We can wait on you, we push up to the spot so the whole sit down. And I miss my bro, tryna line my schedule, I'm moving around. Till 2 damn long, tryna make myself, tryna find my ground.
This is another one of those cases where I know some are going to claim that I'm bending the rules, and I'm sorry, I don't particularly care. You've watched this far. Kuru is absolutely on the fringes of rage, leaning even more towards digicore and even hyperhop in the spacey, dance-ready, more introspective rap, especially with their more reserved delivery, with more affiliations leaning towards Xavier So Bass, including a great collab here with Glass, than, let's say, a lot of the Rage mainstays. Although they're currently collaborating and touring with Lucy Bedrock, and as such, the production has brought in some more distinct cascading color in the synth and percussion choices, like the jittery synth waves of I Can Live With That, or the hazy dance bounce of Like Glue, the watery wheedling of Shibuya Transfer, the jerk flip of FW19, or the sprawling haze of the closer 3 Worlds Apart. Even at the mastering can be a little dicey. That's very Rage. It's gotten a little better here, like with the gently watery You Would Never Do It. Even if I would argue that it might not take as many big melodic swings, the flows are a decent bit sharper, and the subject matter takes a bit of a different angle. Because, yeah, there are plenty of We Made It flexing and brand names, but Kuru admit they've been taking some losses in the process. The brands are a little bit more eclectic, many of them Japanese. The anime references, they feel a little bit more niche and nerdy, and there's more admissions of alienation, be it tied to their queerness or feeling a little too old and mature for the online scene that they've long worked within, distancing themselves from a lot of idiots who are in the scene, or just a sense of nomadic loneliness that has them always on the move, which becomes the reality as a touring musician. It's fascinating to hear the contrast to someone like Skaiwater, where hedonism and sex and drugs were always at the forefront, where for Kuru, they seem canny enough to step back, put in a lot of the work, do what they can handle and avoid a lot of the nonsense in the scene with a more methodical attitude, even as they are still going to flex. That does mean it can feel like we're a half step away from some truly revealing vulnerability. Kuru feels a little bit more guarded, and given what they say about suicidal ideation on Let the Keys Cry, I kind of understand why, especially when a couple songs later they're taking pot shots at a former collaborator. Why expose weaknesses? But it's at least trying to be a little bit more contemplative in that direction. It's a very nice change of tone, and I respect that. But this is where I also want to highlight something very interesting within Rage that deserves its own special place, its own tangent. A very cavalier acceptance of queerness. This is extremely uncommon when you consider hip-hop's long history. Hell, if you saw what YG put out this year, it's still struggling mightily in the present, and yet it's been baked into this scene for longer than I think some people realize. As much as some will still misgender them, Lil Uzi Vert has been out as non-binary for years now. And while it's not surprising given how much cultural exchange there is with other predominantly online scenes like hyperpop or digicore, it's still very commendable how normalized queerness is amongst Rage. Because I remember the 2010s. And the slow strides that hip-hop tried to make towards embracing gay and even trans artists, every halting step and pronounced backslide, to say nothing of the anti-queer backlash in full swings across chunks of the world right now, and Rage music just blithely roars on, where queerness and gender bending is so normalized that if you saw transphobia or homophobia, I can imagine a real backlash, starting with, we ain't about that. I mean, I didn't expect to feel emotional about it. I'm a little surprised that I am, but I think some in the scene are so young they don't really recognize how meaningful it actually is. And with a certain twisted irony that queerness is accepted alongside outright misogyny, often with the attitude that if you can keep up with the appetite, nobody really cares that much what or who you're running through. But I think, at least here, the kids seem to be all right. But I'm not going to say I'm not worried. Some of the biggest names in Rage right now don't always appear to have a fully formed view of their politics or introspection with some tangible underlying reactionary sentiments. And the old guard hasn't exactly gone away or gotten rid of their prejudices if the money is right. Thus, I like when Kuru has a throwaway line about not supporting fashy elements in the scene. And it's not remotely surprising that the sentiment would come from a queer artist who has a lot to lose. But how easy would it be for someone to push in a more anti-queer direction under a veneer of irony, or just outright reactionary sentiment playing to some misguided false truism of common sense if it went hard enough, and get that young fan base who runs near enough to those spaces online to just fall in? I can point to any number of streamers who run alongside the rage scene who certainly flirt with a lot of that territory and that politic. It's happened before with less provocation. I can go back to how nu metal and rap rock and horrorcore behaved against that backlash in political correctness, but I don't even have to go that far. In the late 2010s, there was a backlash in hip-hop towards what was being perceived as conscious or woke, who made up with a lack of talent with just offensiveness, often directly tagged in their personal lives, or part of their appeal was that they existed in the space and flaunted good taste. Kodak Black, 6ix9ine, you could argue XXXTentacion, Lil Uzi Vert, even Playboi Carti fit in this territory. And when you're in a race to the bottom ecosystem to get that money, where the label will sign and back people with more flashy hype than substance, the ease that comes with cheap transgression is gonna be tempting. That's something you gotta keep an eye out for. And speaking of major pushes that might be questionable...
She say that she on her way. She say that she wanna make up. I can tell this finna fuck my day up. No, I ain't thinking about it like the blunt up. Niggas talking down, I don't say nothing. Make it really easy like a layup.
So this is one of the bigger names you may have seen associated with Rage from outside of the Opium Crew. He's from Buffalo. After his blow up in 2024, he got signed to Atlantic and dropped a project last year. And this is his first mixtape associated with that label. Someone get back to me when they coherently define what's different between mixtapes and full-length albums these days. Even around sample clearances is fuzzier than ever. And off the first listen, you get why Atlantic actually signed him. Easily some of the most polished and breezy productions so far in terms of brighter melodies and engineering, while still capable of a breadth of emotion with some moodier tracks. It is tuneful enough to catch the ear with some recognizable producer tags. If there's a clear descendant to those who think that the Opium Crew might have lost the sauce, you could put Protect in that territory. Hell, with the tinny spikes of Whole Crowd, the rubbery shuffle of RE4, the fluttery pianos behind the cacophonous collapse of AC-130, the shimmering bassy grind of Last of Us, and especially the gentle guitar-driven trap bounce of Skater and the playful stuttering rollick of U-1, I would probably seek this out before the majority of the Opium acts. If this is coming into the mainstream, I'm not sure I'm going to complain. Unfortunately, at some point, you actually have to listen to Protect actually rap, and while there's a part of me that can squint and hear the weird, off-kilter, tumbling melodic flows and try to sketch the Young Thug parallel, or that it fits on the stranger and slightly muted production in order to set the vibe, I get why he sounds like this. The appeal of rappers on this production who sound like the horse tranquilizer just kicked in, and then a horse kicked them to the head and knocked them semi-permanently off beat, it remains limited to me. See also my issues with Ken Carson. It's frustrating because Protect occasionally comes up with a slightly different turn of phrase in his rapping while sticking to the usual stock drug abuse and come up flexing, but his technique is so slapdash that it makes it hard for me to really appreciate any of it. And let's be real, while he's probably a little bit more tastefully breezy than the Opium's pretensions towards fashion goth, it feels way too conceptually limited to go much further. And while, again, we'll get into this later, if you don't have a lot of energy backing your distorted rage, and the content's only so-so, and the flows are mediocre at best, what's gonna draw me back to Protect? Especially as I would argue he has sounded a lot less inspired since signing to Atlantic in the first place. For full disclosure here, the friend of mine who helped assemble and curate this list of artists for me to explore suggested him at the last possible minute to fill a gap in for a rapper who was suggested, who wasn't really Rage at all, so much as just all over the damn place. I'll leave you guessing who that wound up being. And while I think there's a vibe here, yeah, it's a swing and a miss, at least for me. Again, the mainstreams have really letting us all down. And yet by this point, I think all of you who know me are thinking that I have been giving all this a little too much grace in the lyrics department. Or at least I should be coming down way harder for content that's perceived to be vapid. After all, I built a reputation over 13 years on this platform as being someone who prioritizes songwriting. And for as much as I might praise some elements of Rage, they're not traditionally called lyricists, especially if you're a longtime underground hip-hop fan, which I am. And if it was just about flows, I would say fair enough. Most of these guys are not great rappers or staying on beat or stringing together impressive rhymes or the double entendres. One of the reasons I praise Slayr so much is that he's got that level of technical competency. Even by the standards of crunk or trap, this can feel like scraping the bottom of the barrel. I would argue that there's a lot more talent if you're paying attention to the fine details, in the same way I would argue like Ludacris has never received the acclaim he deserved in the 2000s for sheer technical rapping, but that was true for a lot of rappers out of the South at the time, still true for certain circles to this day. And with Rage specifically, given the vocal distortion and the prioritization of these blunt anthemic phrases, it is built to serve the audience that is not really looking for challenging depth. If the hook goes hard enough, that might be enough. But also, those are critiques coming from outside of the scene by those who wouldn't get it. I mean, if you listen to enough Rage, a more measured argument is that most of the kids making this music aren't really doing enough lyrically to differentiate themselves from each other. Case in point, if I swap lyrics from Protect or Vax or Skaiwater or Kuru and you can't tell them apart song over song, that might be a problem where the production's doing the heavy lifting over saying anything more distinctive that punches out. It's where quotable lines or more interesting concepts song over song really have a place. It was true 20 years ago and 10 years ago, and it's still true now. In fact, if there's a greater problem rooted within Rage, it's the tension between the acts that are trying to add more flavors to the format in attitude or theme or content, and those who only want it to hit a specific set of enraged hip-hop signifiers, where they tend to find common ground with the folks who are starting to wonder why specific favorite artists of theirs have become so stale playing to the formula. Now, this is where I could absolutely drag out a moralism argument in playing to the most base impulses of predominantly young guys. I know Rage tends to have more acceptance and queerness thanks to Gen Z, and there are women who want to be in the scene, but this is an incremental shift at best, doesn't really sidestep some of the rampant misogyny, which, again, still kind of a thing. Much of the wish fulfillment here is reactionary, kind of graphically gooner brain, where I have to wonder if some of the backlash again to Slayr comes with the fact that he seems more positive and well-adjusted while living out that fantasy. And that's before we get into the frankly appalling laundry list of allegations attached to so many of the artists themselves. It took a lot of work to assemble a list at time of recording without a lot of those artists that have allegations featured. I wanted to keep this somewhat clean. Don't want to drag in separate art from the artist here. And this is where I could also get into the circular argument of whether the art reflects the culture thereof or the other way around. And this is a larger issue of how we raise boys in relationship to masculinity or patriarchy, white boys in particular. There's an excellent Dacia Sade video on the subject around Eminem and angry music targeted at white audiences. That's really required viewing here, link in the description. And the reality that art should also be allowed to express negative emotions, even at their most base and ugly, and there should be some element of education. But the more telling side to all this is that if your entertainment hits the same hedonistic notes of dick-sucking groupies over and over again, the thrill wears off. It becomes routine. It doesn't feel special, certainly not transgressive in its provocation. Dare I even say, generic? I don't use the word generic often when talking about art, and I actually have a very good reason why. Because that word is all based on the context in which art exists beyond itself. That means if I'm calling something generic, it requires you to know more about all the art around it in the scene and already be a little bit bored of it. You've decided what the norm is. Take the Billboard Hot 100. The average Rage song from this video would stick out like a sore thumb over there in terms of sound or writing, although possibly less so depending on how much hip-hop you've heard. But amidst the context of 10 Rage acts that I'm covering here, may not feel as special. This is also evident in rage music feeling so decentralized in real-life location. These acts span all across the United States and more, where if they were closer in proximity, they might be able to develop more interesting regional affectations, and by that means they're drawn together with the construct of the internet, the shared playlist and Discord servers, where especially in terms of the streamers, there's more incentive towards sounding similar to each other so they get on the same list and they break through. That's not saying the local scene is built to help them diversify their approach and break through either. Rap Critic had a great observation on this I've been thinking about for a decade now. Let's put the clip in here.
This is the point where I say that this guy sounds like Future, with the brave, groundbreaking piece of information that might be. But let me let you guys in on a little secret. Have you ever listened to underground rap? I don't mean guys like Action Bronson or Danny Brown, like no one knows them outside of their hometown underground. Yeah, go listen to your local rap radio station when they play their local talent, and especially in the South, you might find a little pattern. Everyone sounds like Future. Yeah, contrary to what most may believe, the underground isn't some purity zone where every rapper is a boundary-pushing musician being shut down by a music industry that won't dare show true, raw talent. Nah, most of it's just a hopeless dredge of copycats, imitating whatever's popular and easiest to imitate. No, seriously, go to the limelight hour of your local rap stations where they play regional artists on Sundays at 11 p.m. and you'll see that Designer is not alone in his attempt to replicate what's popular. Truth is, in 2016, if you're signing a guy after he's only made 3 songs, chances are pretty good that he's going to sound like Future.
And Rage's seemingly diminished focus on lyricism might mean being considered generic matters a little bit less if what you're focusing on is the sound. But I'm sorry, that also kind of feels like a cop-out. I might remember or like a great melody or a hook, but if I'm given a little bit more meat to appreciate in the writing, be it quotables, more robust themes, even pushing the boundaries a little further, that's going to stick out more. That's the stuff that winds up on year-end lists. I can point at the pileup of mediocre mainstream rap albums this year with the same feature list and producers, where they're more remembered for moments than as unique bodies of work, and it proves my point. More meat for the grinder. And on that extremely dark note and implication...
Haters talking but I'm doing what they can't. My cup dark red like the nails of your aunt. Continental Molly got me in a trance, cause I'm living every day like it's my last.
So Fimiguerrero is a name I recognize with some associations with SD Kid, who had his short-lived chart success earlier this year. And while I was genuinely caught off guard by the more pronounced political provocation that underscored his mid-2020s work, which showed for a moment a little more ambition, especially on Immigrant, where alongside the flexing you could tell he relished playing that immigrant villain, or at least how certain Tories and Reform in the UK would have cast him as such, which is considerably more challenging conceptually than a lot of Rage is, which was enough at first to excuse some shaky mixing in the operatic blend of Rage and jerk music. Unfortunately, on his project New World Order, he tilted way more into the party girl songs where the energy just did not really fit that well, wasn't really as ambitious. He kind of set an expectation for himself with Immigrant. So I was a little bit surprised when this EP was put on my radar, and I'm actually pleased that it is, because amidst the slate of Rage albums where grasping for greater or more challenging subtext almost feels alien, The Statue of a Fool does something almost brave in its brief runtime amidst the better produced but colder bangers. A self-conscious critique of what success in the Rage scene manifests to actually be. Sure, there can be darkness inside a lot of Rage music, and Fimiguerrero's got his fair share of flexing against hard beats that can be taken on the base level, but then he flips the lens inwards, and it's not exactly pretty. The stuff that can spoil the endless party, the easy flash and money that's got its real draw but doesn't drive generational wealth. Blame the labels for it. Hard drugs and subsequent addictions. Meaningless sex that distracts from intimacy or real vulnerability. Good Girl is one of the few cases where one of his girl songs actually lands because he gets more vulnerable. And so many scores of adoring fans looking for all of it, leaving the frontman feeling lonely, trapped. damn near frozen. He's playing into a negative archetype that brings him success but won't allow him more expressive humanity, with enough of the look in the mirror to realize that none of this is going to solve the deeper grievances at his core, where he has become that titular statue of the fool, where every shot on you, on loser, might as well be spoken at himself, where Cocaina's blown out bassy chill has the wretched gut-wrenching emptiness of craving that next hit, and Mind the Gap takes his guitar loop and slimy keys to sit in misery and depression, where he pulls out a pretty solid singing voice to express pleas for anyone to come as the crushing grind just pummels him on the aptly named Don't Leave Me. It's a really affecting EP, a little bit of a conceptual experiment that commits to the subject and delivers. And while I'm not going to say it's revolutionary or that new, hip-hop over the course of decades has struggled with the relationship of an audience that cares less about the artists and their struggles versus entertainment, where in the context of a black art form and a predominantly white audience, it's extremely revealing. And sure, there are cuts like the weedy oscillations of Duddy that I wish clicked better, or Skywalker, where it seems more straightforward and Fake Mink clearly didn't get the memo about the overarching concept, but it may also be the starkest critique coming from within Rage itself of the scene and sound, from an artist getting older and who proved to have a sharper metatextual edge in his writing, conscious of how he and his scene are perceived and willing to explore the humanity on all sides. For as much as Rage posits a certain nihilistic bleakness at its most popular, this is the bigger systemic picture that is far more grim and a lot more daunting, where the backlash towards it would come at a different angle. Shut up, you're ruining the fun, it's not that deep, let us have this. As if there's a terrified refusal to engage with the human cost of having all of that debauched excess and assuming there wouldn't be consequences. To me, it feels like the polar opposite of any burger music commentary, because while that incoherently paints someone as the studied tool of the system, irregardless of that's true, this actively takes the system and the audience to account, where they'd probably wind up liking it even less, especially if there is truth to it. But this is where we open up a challenging can of worms about what a genre actually can do, especially when you're exploring deconstruction, and the crossroads that Rage is very much at, between those who only want it to be an outlet for adolescent fantasy at its most debased, at its simplest, because in contrast, that's where it finds its most power and populism, but those who also think there's a core that can be built up, greater artistry refined. It might not have the same meat-headed fundamental power, but is more interesting, potentially more complex on the other side. And what's so powerful, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this question, because it's a conversation we have had before. A genre targeted at youth disaffection with roots in the distorted, angry, negative scenes that flipped established musical conventions on their head and yet very quickly were commercialized. And in an era of progressive politics, when a reactionary conservative backlash was brewing, it forced the conversation, the fork in the road, between a populist bent that could and would indeed be co-opted by bad actors at its simplest, versus a more refined school that might have more critical acclaim, but could just as easily be co-opted by the forces of capitalism and the fickle arts of popularity, where the weird edge persisted, but for those who wanted their mainstream time to last, gradually got sanded down, succumbing to that status quo, selling out. I speak, of course, of the punks of the 1970s, as their genre fractured between hardcore and post-punk at the very end of that decade, and everything in between that happened. You could argue it happened with hip-hop once before in the late 90s as well, between the ascendance of the shiny suit commercialization versus the edgy, macho swagger adjacent to horrorcore and nu metal. What's telling about Rage is that history's not repeating, but it's rhyming certainly better than some of their best MCs, and choices can still be made. Or rather, you can recognize that it doesn't have to be a binary. You can kind of do both. Maybe be all the better for it.
Yeah, okay. Only real punks gon' understand me. You a fan of ezcodylee, you family. Fuck them all, I'm everything they said I can't be. Did this shit, I can't name nothing that they hand me. Both these bitches bad, I hit a double whammy. Take them bitches down to RKO like Randy.
know, might feel too easy to end up here, but sometimes when your previous album in this series is a spoof of American Idiot on the cover, and this album is set up with an intro sample of Matthew Lillard talking about the origins of punk rock, I mean, the writing's being done for me. Even then, if we're speaking about an artist who hits that white-hot crux point of rage with an easy crossover to rock and punk music, and delivered a great album to boot, it's ezcodylee. And on the surface, it is also the easiest act for me to praise. The Rage production is way more grounded in guitar transitions, where the guitar distortion fuses with a blown-out bass compression. It feels purpose-built for the live show with its sequencing and to play from front to back. That switch up from Album of the Year to the hardcore rap rock of Who Got a Problem goes so damn hard. And while the Rage distortion introduces some crushing texture like the grindingly visceral vomit and shut up, it's actually consistently balanced, where the melodies and grooves can pop alongside of it. And that's not including the songs like Don't Be Scared and Tour that just do both, or the killer bass lines that drive force style. It helps ezcodylee has steadily sharpened his flows that previously could be more than a little slapdash, and he's got a knack for softer pop-punk melodies like Star that are built for the possible crossover. Although I will say the actual band crossover with Happy Deathman on Die Hard isn't quite as balanced in their intensity as it could be. I feel like the vocal mixing kind of de-emphasizes them a bit, even if that guitar solo at the end was pretty rad and the transition to Bad Apple was terrific. But ezcodylee is also looking to meet the moment with more of actual punk ethos, not just highlighting the gatekeepers that would keep him out of some of those punk or rock spaces because he's black, and making rage music with more attitude than some of that scene. Who Got a Problem makes his thoughts vividly clear on this front, but will also try and be a little bit more political, confrontational with his content, and I feel like I've been waiting for that this entire video. On Die Hard, he says Free Palestine. On Mosh Pit and Force Style, he makes it very clear he does not fuck with the current United States Republican administration, including already fuck ICE and anti-fascism sentiment, echoed by that Charlie Kirk line on Shut Up. On Family First, he not only stands 10 toes down for his community, he shoots at Shay, reportedly for being pissed off that Shay dropped a homophobic slur on record. I told you that backlash would occur. And that's to say nothing of the more melodically focused songs that are trying for more vulnerability. His genuine fear of being on such a huge stage with such a microphone, the difficulty of holding to his principles when wealth and power and women are being thrown at you too fast. Tour is all about that. And when he fucks up, there are the pop-punk adjacent ballads where he's trying to win her back. That sort of vulnerability, in its way, in comparison with the rest of the genre, that's punk in its own right. Now, it's not perfect by a long shot. You can tell the album feels a bit transitional and balancing punk ethics with what is expected out of him on a Rage record, especially alongside battling his own angst. I don't love the downbeat tilt towards a darker, we're all gonna die and nobody can truly know each other on the closing song. I feel like he could have ended with a little bit more populist spark. He has it throughout the rest of the album. But again, that song is aptly titled Nobody's Perfect. Makes sense. And yet it works. Because at the epicenter, ezcodylee is charging forth into the brink and willing to meet the moment. I'll say it again. Difficult though it will be, willing to let himself get choked up in the moment, which feels all the more immersive on cuts like One Day. And if he needs to scream and stunt over all of it in order to reach catharsis on the other side, so be it. The album's freaking great. And for a lot of rock-leaning fans, if you want on-roads to the scene, here you go. But, okay, let's take a step back. What did I learn from all this? Am I now fully sold on Rage? Am I getting into the pit? Truthfully, I'm about as sold on it as any subgenre of hip-hop. Once understood how it could work for me and what I liked within it, I found a lot to like. Some great songs, great albums, more than I expected. And man, it's a thrilling experience. I wish more people had that sort of curiosity to step outside their comfort zone and engage sincerely with art before opening their mouths on social media and talk about something they don't understand. And as someone who now gets it, I'm all the better for it. I had a lot of fun putting this together. Now, it's not all for me. Obviously. It shouldn't be. Every single act on this list is about at least 10 years younger than my mid-30s ass. What aesthetics and experiences that drive the social construct of their taste, it's going to be radically different than mine. And that's okay. I can accept and accommodate that. And with that in mind, I'm also aware that I got a curated slate of these acts from a friend who knows enough of my taste to recommend me 10 acts they thought I would like, along with a couple curveballs for shits and giggles, because I don't think there was any other way in hell I would have talked about Too Slimy. But I think even though it's a genre that on its face might not encourage deeper thought in comparison to that carnal sensory experience, the raw feeling of it all, there is enough here to be worthy of deeper examination. Common ground, potent themes that can be found if you're choosing to look. We've got more in common than we often think. Why use this as divisive? But I also think I was extremely lucky in this moment to explore Rage. I go back to that Pitchfork review I said at the very beginning of Ken Carson's experiment, and his underlying sentiment that when critics talk about a scene in decline or being over in sharp contrast with growing audience share, it's because they either want it to be over or they want to stop talking about it. And man, I could not think of a worse time to take that sentiment. Yeah, Rage might not be quite as cool or popping in a very specific hypebeast lane. It might not even be as artistically innovative, even though I would push back on that. The biggest names might not be doing it any justice, that's certainly true. But these 10 albums in 2026 reveal that Rage is at a sort of crossroads that can define the soul of a genre for years to come, with a wealth of creative experimentation both within and without. There's real tension between a specific, narrow, borderline reactionary brand of contradictory cool that doesn't have to mean anything, and the artists that believe Rage can mean more, and approach the genre with sincerity, craft, hope for the future. If you're a music critic and can't find something intensely compelling about that, especially as the sound continues to expand with the throngs to match it and what it could say about those throngs, you're letting the game be dictated by the incurious who chase nebulous hype over art. And a lot of bad actors who can spot an audience they can relentlessly farm amidst all that sweat and noise. We can do better. I mean, I can't dictate whatever future is coming, nor would I want to. I want the artists and I want the fans to do it. And for as much as I'm part of that, I'm happy to contribute. And right now, that path forward is as muddy as some of these mixes. But there's a reason you wear combat boots to music festivals. When it gets muddy, it gets hard to go forward, it gets a little dirty. Sometimes the only way to get traction and push forward is to stomp it out. So open up the pit. There's some big steppers coming through.